Assalamu alaikum, fam. Hope you're doing fantastic. So we're continuing our reading of St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica. We're in the 5th article, which is titled, Whether Sacred Doctrine is Nobler Than Other Sciences. So this is the objection of number 1 that someone poses, and Aquinas will answer it with his reply. But this is what they kind of ask him. It seems that sacred doctrine is not nobler than other sciences. For the nobility of a science depends on the certitude it establishes. But other sciences, the principles of which cannot be doubted, seem to be more certain than sacred doctrine. For its principles, namely, articles of faith, can be doubted, therefore other sciences seem to be nobler. So the element of doubt comes in. And it's interesting how he says, this person, well, the amount of certitude. So, therefore, nobility is tied to certitude and the limit of doubt. However, if you know the scientific method, they do doubt, and they will also go about proving what they can prove, and the sciences that they lay down anyways can be disproven later by someone else. So there's still doubt, right? And the way in which Aquinas will answer is quite elementary in its delivery, but in its eloquence quite profound. Reply to objection 1. It may well happen that what is in itself the more certain may seem to us the less certain on account of the weakness of our intelligence. So notice how he mentions the weakness of our intelligence. So in this element of doubt coming in, do you doubt because you are weak in your mind or because you want to find certitude? There's a lot of elements to examine here. Which is dazzled by the clearest objects of nature, as the owl is dazzled by the light of the sun. So this is pretty interesting, because what do we become dazzled by? Doubt can come in when we are overwhelmed and our senses are overwhelmed, and when our intelligence is lacking in some area, right? Hence, the fact that some happen to doubt about articles of faith is not due to the uncertain nature of the truth, but to the weaknesses of human intelligence. So again here, the weakness of human intelligence is what will lead to doubt, but it's not the doctrines in and of themselves. So he contends the sacred doctrine, which is of Catholicism, right, that it is not uncertain simply because you doubt. Rather, it's the opposite. And he continues, yet the slenderest knowledge that may be obtained of the highest things is more desirable. Okay, so the highest thing he contends is God. Slenderest knowledge. So even if you get a sliver of an insight into the higher order of things, of religion, of God, that is still something more profound than anything which can be figured out by the human mind, because the supreme mind of God outweighs the human intelligence, because humans are not that clever, right? So it is quite interesting the way he worded that. Obtained of the highest things is more desirable than the most certain knowledge obtained of lesser things. So lesser things, earthly things, whereas the more noble is that of religion, he contends, right? As is said in De Anima Libus. So notice here again, that is a pretty apt reply. So you may only get a slender amount of what is noble within the religion, right? Of what he contends is the sacred doctrine, but that still will be more valuable than all the knowledge of lesser things of less importance in this existence. So you being dazzled by doubts does not mean that the doctrines in and of themselves are weaker. Rather, you just need to improve your intelligence. And there is an element of faith. So articles of faith are more noble because they give you an insight to the higher order, whereas the lesser things deal with more, bird mating seasons, climate patterns, things that have utility, but indeed they are lesser because they're not dealing with your internal soul and to your overall existence in this dimension, right? utility isn't futile. However, utility isn't the end-all be-all, and you are not here to study the lesser things, but the higher things. So it is quite interesting the way he responds. So that was objection 1. And then, in objection 2, further, it is the sign of a lower science to depend upon a higher. So this is interesting. So a lower science depending upon a higher. He's using that as kind of an insult. So let's see. As music depends upon arithmetic. If you haven't studied music, I have taken classes on it. There is some elements of math in it. So music depending upon arithmetic in order to have a harmonic nature is a astute observation. But sacred doctrine does, in a sense, depend upon the philosophical sciences. So this is interesting how he has done that twist there. So sacred doctrine, i.e. theology, depending on philosophical sciences. This is interesting. For Jerome observes in his epistle to Magnus that the ancient doctors so enrich their books with the ideas and phrases of the philosophers that thou knowest not what more to admire in them, their profane erudition or their scripture learning. Therefore, sacred doctrine is inferior to other sciences. So profane erudition, so their sort of elementary way of speaking about their stances on metaphysics and such. So here, this is a bit catty, but indeed you can argue semantics on language, right? So their erudition being defined on the terms of linguistics is a bit something that should be examined. So the phrases, right, the eruditions, the ideas. So the premises, though, of those ideas, were not inferior, because indeed their inquiry is what led to people wanting to inquire more, which stemmed from science. The scientific mode of looking at things, wanting to know your position in the cosmos, religion started with that. God told you why you are here, and then people went beyond that to discover why is that there, right? So I would argue it's the inverse, whereas the other sciences depend upon the religious sciences, because the religious sciences are what make us want to ask why we're here and to discover the universe around us and to observe God's creation. But let's see how Aquinas answers. This science can, in a sense, depend upon the philosophical sciences, not as though it stood in need of them. So notice this, standing in need of it. So depending upon versus standing in need, but only in order to make its teaching clear. So here he talks about, well, philosophy, the philosophical sciences, can help make certain teachings of the dogmas and the rites more clear. That doesn't necessarily mean you're a crutch. Rather, it helps make something more explicit, which shows its utility, but it doesn't mean it negates from it, right? For it accepts its principles, not from other sciences, but immediately from God. So notice how the sacred doctrine he's contending comes from the principles of God and immediately from God, directly from God, not as in stemming from human reason. By revelation. So we have revelation versus human reason. Therefore, it does not depend upon other sciences as upon the higher, but makes use of them as the lesser. So notice this. So using them, making use of them, they are lesser. Remember how he said that the religion is more noble because it deals with higher things. So everything else that doesn't have to do with your eternal soul and the religion of the sacred doctrine he contends is of the lesser. So the philosophical science help make things clear, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are dependent upon it, right? And as handmaidens, even so the master science make use of the sciences that supply their materials, as political of military science. So notice how he gave a good example here. You can have a very strong military, but if you don't know how to enact it politically, you can also fail. Because politics and military force go hand in hand, right? Very apt observation. because one is execution and one is brute force, in a way. That it thus uses them is not due to its own defect or insufficiency, but to the defect of our intelligence. Again, here he reiterates the weakness of human intelligence. Remember how he mentioned that earlier, that you may have doubts, but the doubt does not necessarily mean that there's a weakness in the articles of faith. Rather, it is in the weakness of human intelligence, right? So here again he mentions that just because theology, the sacred doctrine as he puts it, can be made more clear through the philosophical sciences, that doesn't mean there's a defect in the theology just because they utilize it as a tool for rhetoric, right? So you're able to use the philosophical sciences to help make your dogmas more clear to someone who isn't as well versed and who doesn't have the capacity to think at a higher level, but it doesn't mean there's a defect in the dogmas thereof, you see? Which is more easily led by what is known through natural reason, from which proceeded the other sciences. So notice how these other sciences came through natural reason. So the divine revelation versus natural reason being inferior to revelation because revelation comes immediately from God, whereas the other sciences stem from and are limited by the human intelligence, right? As in God being a higher form of intelligence, so therefore it would already be more noble and more higher. So again, he's really doing a fantastic job. To that which is above reason, such as are the teachings of this science. So religion is above reason, because to assume that the human mind can grasp everything within this cosmos is absurd. We are bound by our skulls and the neurons of our mind and our overall genetics and environment. And our brains are constantly afflicted by food, drugs, pollution, and every other factor. And to think that we know all the answers because some people in a lab coat told us a certain mathematical equation, or knew some chemistry, or know how to map out the stars, or know how to put a rocket into space, that doesn't necessarily negate anything of God's divine order, and nor does it make it a less noble science. So very, very interesting. And then here's another one of his points. On the contrary, other sciences are called the handmaidens of this one. Wisdom sent her maids to invite to the tower. So notice this handmaiden. So a handmaiden is somebody who goes about helping the queen. And the queen is more of the mind who can handle such affairs, whereas the handmaidens help her to carry out what she must do with other menial tasks, but they are not the ones who rule the empire. So it's a very interesting example of theology being like the queen and the handmaidens being philosophy, right? Sort of making things a little bit more easier, but they're not the ones in control, nor the ones to be sought for clarification of affairs. I answer that since this science is partly speculative and partly practical, it transcends all other speculative and practical. So notice the speculative and practical angle he has here. Now, one speculative science is said to be nobler than another, either by reason of its greater certitude or by reason of the higher worth of its subject matter. So notice this. Certitude and subject matter. So the subject matter of your eternal soul is really important. Certainty is related to the doubt, and the doubt comes in through your lack of, human reason and such. But your existence on this planet and the divine order and you being held accountable for what you did, that is a very big subject matter, more than philosophical semantics and other sciences and such, because they will help you in this realm, but in the next realm, they're not really going to help you, are they? In both these respects, this science surpasses other speculative sciences in point of greater certitude, because other sciences derive their certitude from the natural light of human reason. Exactly. So the extraction of their certitude bound and limited and only within the framework of human reason, right? Which can err. Whereas this derives its certitude from the light of the divine knowledge. So again, divine knowledge, revelation, your inability to control your doubts and to really reflect is not anything to do with the validity of the subjects, but rather your inability to comprehend. And you should seek and ask to comprehend, which cannot be misled. In point of the higher worth of its subject matter, because this science treats chiefly of those things which by their sublimity transcends human reason. So transcending human reason. So mathematics, right? Let's take that as just a minor example. A toddler may not know the quadratic formula, even if the quadratic formula can have some utility. The toddler not knowing how to do the quadratic formula does not take away from it. So your inability to understand certain dogmas, or as he puts it, the divine sciences and the sacred doctrine, is not a reflection of those doctrines, as they are inferior, right? Because you depend upon human reason doesn't make you more superior or more in control of your destiny and such. While other sciences consider only those things which are within reason's grasp. Only within reason's grasp. So if you're only operating within a framework of what is something you can comprehend, of course, you're going to maybe get a bloated ego and think it's the only thing worth studying because it's the only thing you can attain. But again, even within the bounds of human reason, very few people in and of themselves go to the full peak of their understanding. There's still much left to be had on the order of the universe, and a supreme mind, a supreme controller, the master of all dominion, is going to have more control over that dominion because they're not limited to the small neuron network of the human brain, right? So it's quite different. So a higher order, higher science, a more noble science is definitely not going to be limited within the bounds of human reasons. Rather, humans are bound by their own reason, and therefore you must not get really haughty about it. Of the practical sciences, that one is nobler, which is ordained to a further purpose. So if it's a practical science, okay, what is the further purpose? And that will tell you its nobility. As political science is nobler than military science. So this is interesting. So military science versus political science, because the political part has the diplomacy, whereas the military science is the execution and stratagem. But the political science angle does come on with other consequences that are weighed when in measuring what action to take. So for what I mean is, like, so the military science would be execute the orders by all means, and political science might have more of a trade policies, economic policies, other factors, where in military it's still difficult, but you need to have some finesse, and your military leaders need to have a bit of politics in them, right? But then again, they do have a relationship that overlaps, so they are codependent on each other, both of them, but he contends that the political science is actually more nobler, but that's his opinion, but still, he has a point from both angles. Further, for the good of the army is directed to the good of the state. You notice that? So, the good of the army, the good of the state. What's good for the state is good for the army, right? But the purpose of this science, insofar as it is practical, is eternal bliss. So eternal bliss dealing with the sacred doctrine, so that's the higher order he was mentioning about. So the subject matter of what it's dealing with will tell you about its nobility. So eternal bliss being paradise, the hereafter, and such. To which, as an ultimate end, the purposes of every practical science are directed. Hence it is clear that from every standpoint, it is nobler than other sciences. So, because it's dealing with eternal bliss, it makes it more noble. It surpasses human reason, and it isn't bound by human reason, and it deals with a higher subject matter, which is more important to your overall life. And, again, that is what he wants to speak about. Fantastic. So, what do you think?